The air in the room was the color of stale coffee and tasted of recycled oxygen and quiet desperation. It was a sensitive, compartmented information facility, a SCEF, buried 3 levels below the Pentagon's manicured lawns. There were no windows. The only light came from the cool, flat rectangles of 3 massive screens displaying cascading lines of encrypted code, topographical maps of a hostile nation, and a single, blinking red icon labeled Chimera. For 1 hour and 53 minutes, that icon had been the silent, unblinking god in the room, and the men gathered around the polished mahogany table were its failing acolytes. There were 2 generals, Air Force General Markham, a man whose posture seemed forged from rebar, and Army General Davies, whose face was a roadmap of forgotten desert campaigns. There was a deputy director from the NSA, a woman with eyes that missed nothing and offered even less. There was Mr. Thorne, the CEO of the private defense contracting firm that had built the digital architecture of Chimera, a man whose $5,000 suit seemed to be wilting under the pressure. And there was Lieutenant Commander Evan Reese, call sign Spectre, a Navy SEAL whose operational team was on standby, waiting for an entry vector that did not exist. He was there to be the kinetic option, the last resort. Right now, he was just a witness to institutional paralysis. In a simple chair set against the wall, away from the table, sat an old man. He hadn't spoken a word since being escorted in. His hands, thick-knuckled and scored with the kind of lines soil leaves over a lifetime, rested on his knees. He wore worn-out denim, a faded flannel shirt, and a pair of dusty work boots that looked profoundly out of place on the pristine government carpet. A dented, green thermos sat on the floor beside him. No one looked at him. No one addressed him. He was a piece of procedural furniture, a box to be checked. Reese had initially assumed he was a local landowner, some farmer whose property abutted a critical ground station, brought in to sign an eminent domain waiver. A necessary but irrelevant fixture. The logic is circular, General Markham stated, his voice a low growl of contained fury. He jabbed a finger at the screen. Every access protocol we try routes back to a dead-end authentication server. It's not just locked. It's a snake eating its own tail. Mr. Thorne, the contractor, leaned forward, his face gleaming with a thin sheen of sweat. General, the system is performing exactly as designed. It was built to be impenetrable, an autonomous, closed-loop intelligence network. The failure isn't in the architecture. It's that the kill switch handshake is being refused. Refused by whom? Thorne? Davies cut in, his voice sharp. You told us it was automated. Is there a ghost in your machine? There are redundant fail-safes, Thorne said, his confidence a brittle shell. But something external, a signal we can't trace, seems to have locked them out. It's unprecedented. Reese watched the exchange, his gaze drifting from the agitated faces at the table to the still figure in the corner. The old man hadn't moved. He hadn't even blinked. But his eyes, Reese noticed for the first time, were not vacant. They were not the eyes of a bewildered civilian caught in a bureaucratic storm. They were calm, measuring. They tracked the conversation, moving from speaker to speaker with an economy that felt trained. It was a subtle thing, a flicker of observation that registered on Reese's professional frequency. While the generals saw a farmer, Reese saw a stillness that wasn't passive. It was a deliberate state of being. The kind of stillness you learn when waiting for a target, when any wasted motion could betray your position. He dismissed the thought. An old farmer. That's all. The argument escalated. Voices rose. Technical jargon flew like shrapnel, quantum encryption keys, cascading subroutines, phantom IP masking. It was a symphony of failure, each instrument playing its part perfectly. They were brilliant men and women, the best in their fields, and they were all staring at a locked door, describing the complexity of the lock to each other. For nearly 2 hours, they debated how to blow it up, how to trick it, how to starve it of power. Every solution was met with a counter-argument, a new layer of impossibility. Chimera, their greatest intelligence asset, had become their prison. Reese felt a familiar weariness settle in his bones. He'd seen this before on a smaller scale. Too many minds, too much theory, not enough action. His job was to breach walls, not to debate their molecular structure. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 14:47. His team had been on alert for 6 hours. Patience was a virtue, but in his line of work, it was also a diminishing asset. Finally, General Markham slammed a flattened palm on the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, silencing the babble. The resounding quiet was heavy, suffocating. "Enough," Markham breathed, the word ragged. He looked around the table, his eyes landing on each person, a silent indictment. "We're going in circles. The asset is compromised. We can't access it, and we can't shut it down. It's a fortress, a digital ghost in our own house, and we don't have the key." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't a pause in the conversation. It was an admission of defeat. The end of the line. The NSA director stared at her folded hands. Thorne looked at the floor. Davies rubbed his temples, the picture of exhaustion. It was into this vacuum, this profound and absolute silence, that the old man in the corner finally spoke. His voice was not loud. It was dry, like autumn leaves skittering across pavement, yet it filled every inch of the room. "You're trying to open the front door?" He paused, letting the words hang in the sterile air. Every head at the table turned toward him, a slow, synchronized movement of disbelief. The generals, the director, the CEO. They stared at the farmer. He hadn't moved, his hands still resting on his knees. He looked back at them, his gaze as steady and patient as a mountain. Then he finished the sentence. "It was never meant to open." The room froze. Not a single person moved. The low hum of the servers seemed to fade into nothing. The blinking red icon on the screen, Chimera, pulsed in the sudden, deafening quiet. It was as if the old farmer had reached out and pressed a stop button on the world. The sentence was simple, almost childlike in its construction, yet it landed with the force of a tectonic shift, rearranging the entire landscape of their understanding. It was not an opinion. It was not a guess. It was a statement of architectural fact, delivered with an authority that defied the dusty boots and the worn flannel shirt. It implied a knowledge that no farmer, no landowner, no outsider could possibly possess. Lieutenant Commander Reese felt a cold spike of adrenaline, the kind he usually only felt just before a breach. His internal calculus, the finely honed instinct that kept him alive in the field, began a frantic recalibration. He had categorized the man as other, civilian, irrelevant. That categorization now shattered into 1,000 pieces. He replayed the man's posture in his mind. The stillness was not patience, it was discipline. The economic eye movement was not idle observation, it was threat assessment. The worn jacket and faded jeans were not a uniform of poverty. They were a uniform of invisibility. He was camouflaged, hiding in plain sight. General Markham was the first to recover his voice, though it was strained, uncertain. What did you say? Who are you?" The old man's gaze settled on Markham. He did not seem intimidated by the 2 stars on the general's shoulders. He seemed to look past them, at the man wearing them. "My name is Arthur Vance." He offered nothing more. No title, no rank, no explanation. Mr. Thorne, the contractor, let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was a brittle, nervous sound. "With all due respect, General, we're in a national security crisis. I'm not sure we have time for folksy wisdom from Mr. Vance." He gestured dismissively toward Arthur, the movement dripping with condescension. Arthur's eyes shifted to Thorne. There was no anger in them. No offense. There was nothing. It was the kind of dispassionate gaze one might use to observe an insect. The emptiness of it was more unnerving than any threat. "The front door is a decoy," Arthur said, his voice still quiet, still dry. "It's a honeypot. It's designed to attract attention, to absorb brute force attacks, to make an enemy think they're making progress. It's a waste of time. Your time." Reese watched, fascinated. Arthur wasn't arguing. He wasn't defending himself. He was stating facts, as if describing the weather. He was the only person in the room who wasn't trying to prove something. General Davies leaned forward, his elbows on the table. The frustration in his face was being replaced by a cautious, desperate curiosity. A decoy for what? "Mr. Vance, if you know something about this system, you need to tell us." Now, Arthur took a slow breath. He seemed to be considering the request, not as an order, but as a genuine question. He reached down and picked up his thermos. The simple, domestic action was jarring in the high-tech tomb. He unscrewed the cap with a quiet squeak of metal on metal. He didn't pour anything. He just held the open thermos, the gesture thoughtful, deliberate. "Chimera wasn't built to be controlled," he said, looking at the generals, but seemingly speaking to the room itself. It was built to listen, to learn. You think of it as a fortress to be breached. That's the wrong metaphor. It's a root system. It draws everything in. It doesn't have a gate. Thorne scoffed again, louder this time, his composure cracking under the strain. That's absurd. I personally oversaw the final coding. There are triple redundant command protocols. There are kill switches. I have the schematics right here. He tapped the tablet on the table, as if its mere presence validated his reality over Arthur's. Arthur turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on the polished, black surface of Thorne's tablet. Your schematics show you the house, he said. They don't show you the ground it was built on. A heavy silence fell again. The generals exchanged a look. The NSA director, who had remained impassive, now had a single, deep frown line between her eyebrows. She was reassessing. They all were. The old man spoke in analogies, in simple terms, yet his words dismantled Thorne's technical certainty piece by piece. He wasn't just contradicting the contractor. He was invalidating the very premise of their 2-hour debate. Reese found himself studying Arthur's hands. They were farmer's hands, yes. Calloused, stained, the nails cut short and clean. But they held the thermos with a practiced familiarity. There was no tremor, no wasted tension. They were the hands of a man who worked with tools, who understood mechanics, cause and effect. He thought of his own men, how they could strip and reassemble a rifle blindfolded. There was a language in the hands of people who built things, who did things. Arthur's hands spoke that language. So how do we get in, Mr. Vance? General Markham asked. The Mr. was no longer a formality. It was laced with a thread of genuine, if bewildered, respect. Arthur screwed the cap back onto his thermos. The squeak of the threads seemed to echo in the room. He placed it carefully back on the floor beside his chair. You don't, he said. The answer was so blunt, so final, it sucked the remaining hope from the room. Thorne threw his hands up in exasperation. This is a waste of time. General, we need to activate Protocol Scythe. It will involve significant collateral damage to our own infrastructure, but it will isolate and eventually starve the Chimera network. Scythe will take down half the eastern seaboard's power grid, the NSA director countered, her voice dangerously calm. That's not an option. It's a catastrophe. As they began to argue again, their focus shifting away from him, Arthur's eyes met Reese's for a brief second across the room. In that fleeting moment, Reese saw something flicker in the old man's expression. It wasn't frustration or fear. It was a profound, deep-seated weariness. The look of a man who had explained this all before, a long time ago, to people who hadn't listened then, either. The moment passed. Arthur's face became a placid mask once more. But for Reese, it was a confirmation. He wasn't just a hidden veteran. He was something more. He was connected to this. He was the ghost they were all hunting. The argument at the table was becoming frantic, a death spiral of bad options. Thorne was advocating for his scorched earth protocol, a move designed to destroy the evidence of his own system's failure. The generals were caught between the unacceptable risk of Chimera running unchecked and the catastrophic certainty of Thorne's solution. They were trapped by a problem of their own making, and the only person in the room who seemed to understand its nature was the one man they couldn't comprehend. General Davies, a man known for his gut feelings, finally held up a hand. Stop. All of you. He turned his chair to face Arthur directly, cutting everyone else out of his line of sight. He looked at the old man, truly looked at him, for the first time. He saw the dust on his boots, the fraying collar of his shirt, the deep lines etched into his face by sun and time. And he chose to see past it. Mr. Vance, Davies said, his voice low and steady. I'm going to ask you one more time. Forget the metaphors. Forget the front door. Give me a straight answer. Is there a way to shut down Project Chimera? Arthur was silent for a long moment. He seemed to be weighing the general, the room, the entire weight of the situation. Reese held his breath. He felt like he was watching a bomb disposal expert decide which wire to cut. The lock isn't on the door, Arthur said, repeating his earlier cryptic phrase. He let it sit for a beat. It's in the key. What key? Davies pressed, his voice tight with restrained urgency. Where is it? Arthur did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted to the main screen, to the blinking red icon. His expression was unreadable, but Reese could imagine the history swirling behind those calm eyes. He had built this thing. He had to have. He was its father, and it had become a monster. The key, Arthur said slowly, his voice barely a whisper, is the kind that doesn't come up in conversation. Thorne exploded. This is a farce. He's speaking in riddles. We're wasting valuable time on this farmer's poetry. But General Markham had heard enough. Something in Arthur's quiet, maddening certainty had finally broken through his military pragmatism. The risk of trusting this unknown old man was now less than the risk of trusting the failing experts. Thorne, shut your mouth, Markham commanded, his voice like cracking ice. The contractor snapped his jaw shut, his face flushing with anger and humiliation. Markham never took his eyes off Arthur. Son, he said, his gaze flicking to the youngest aide in the room. Get Director Sterling on the line. Use my personal authorization. Tell him it's a chimera event. Tell him we have a man here named Arthur Vance. Reese saw a flicker of something in Arthur's eyes at the mention of the name Sterling. It was the first reactive expression he'd seen. A subtle tightening around the eyes, a minute compression of the lips. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was there. He knew the name. The aide, a young captain with wide, nervous eyes, scrambled to a secure phone in the corner. The room fell into another tense silence, this one filled with a new kind of anticipation. A decision had been made. A new path had been chosen. They were no longer trying to solve the puzzle themselves. They were waiting for someone who might know the man who had designed it. Reese continued his study of Arthur. The man had retreated back into his shell of perfect stillness. He seemed entirely unconcerned with the high-level call being made on his behalf. He could be waiting for a bus. The contrast between his demeanor and the multi-billion-dollar crisis unfolding around him was staggering. It wasn't just calm. It was a level of detachment that spoke of immense experience. This room, this pressure, this level of stakes, it wasn't new to him. It was just another Tuesday. Reese thought about the concept of gray men. Individuals from the intelligence and special operations communities who were trained to be utterly forgettable, to blend into any environment, to move through the world without leaving a ripple. They didn't wear tactical gear. They wore whatever made them invisible. A janitor's uniform, a business suit, or, perhaps, the dusty clothes of an old farmer from a forgotten corner of the country. Arthur Vance was the most effective gray man Reese had ever seen, because no one had even known he was in the game. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was hiding in the light. The wait for Director Sterling's response stretched for what felt like an hour but was, in reality, only 4 minutes. The young captain held the secure phone with a white-knuckled grip, listening. Finally, he looked over at General Markham. Sir, the captain said, his voice trembling slightly. Director Sterling is en route. ETA is 15 minutes. He had only one instruction. What is it, son? Markham asked. The captain swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Arthur. He said, and I quote, "Don't let Mr. Vance leave the room. And for God's sake, don't piss him off." The statement landed in the room with the quiet thud of a body hitting the floor. Mr. Thorne, the contractor, went visibly pale. The two generals looked at Arthur, their expressions a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning, horrified respect. The old farmer they had ignored for 2 hours was someone a man like Director Sterling handled with care. Arthur, for his part, showed no reaction at all. He simply sat in his chair, a silent, patient monument to a history no one in the room had ever known existed. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. It no longer resided at the mahogany table with the men of rank and title. It was sitting in a cheap chair against the wall, wearing a pair of dusty boots. And everyone was waiting for it to speak. The 15 minutes it took for Director Sterling to arrive were the longest of Evan Reese's life. The air in the SCIF grew thick with unspoken questions. No one spoke to Arthur. No one dared. They just watched him, occasionally glancing at each other with looks that said, "Who is this man?" Mr. Thorne sat rigidly in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning professional terror. He had not only failed to control his own system, he had openly mocked the one person who might hold the key. Reese used the time to observe. He committed every detail of Arthur Vance to memory. The way his left hand rested slightly differently than his right, suggesting an old, settled injury. The faint, pale line on his fourth finger where a ring had once been. The way his gaze would periodically sweep the corners of the room, a reflexive, lifelong habit of checking for threats. These were not the details of a farmer. They were the tells of a man who had lived a different, harder life, a life he had packed away under layers of flannel and denim. At precisely 15:26, the reinforced door to the SCIF hissed open. A man in a simple, perfectly tailored gray suit stepped inside. He was in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. This was Director Thomas Sterling, a living legend in the intelligence community, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones in places like this. He had served under 6 presidents. His presence immediately commanded the room. The generals started to rise to their feet out of respect, but Sterling raised a single, placating hand, stopping them. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene with a practiced, all-encompassing glance. He noted the tension, the exhausted faces of the generals, the panicked look on Thorne, the quiet professionalism of Reese. Then his gaze fell upon the old man in the corner. The entire atmosphere in the room changed. The cold, institutional authority that Sterling carried with him seemed to melt away, replaced by something else entirely. Something softer. Reverence. He did not greet the generals. He did not ask for a situation report. He walked directly across the room, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the carpet, and stopped in front of Arthur's chair. He stood there for a moment, not looking down on Arthur, but standing before him, almost as if he were the subordinate. "Arthur," Sterling said, his voice quiet, filled with a complex mix of regret and respect. "It's been a long time." Arthur looked up at him. "Not long enough, Tom." The reply was dry, without rancor, but it carried the weight of years. "I know," Sterling said with a sigh. He looked tired, older than he had a moment ago. "We should have called you sooner. I'm sorry. We tried to manage it ourselves. Pride, I suppose. Pride builds faulty engines," Arthur stated simply. Thorne, seeing his career and reputation evaporating before his eyes, finally broke. He stood up, his voice cracking. "Director, with all due respect, what is going on? This man has been talking in circles. My system." Sterling turned his head slowly, and the coldness returned to his eyes, now magnified 100-fold. He fixed his gaze on Thorne, and the contractor physically flinched, taking a half-step back. "Your system, Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, his voice dangerously low, "is a copy of a copy, a shadow of a design you were never cleared to fully understand. You were given a blueprint for a car, and you tried to fly it to the moon." He turned his back on Thorne, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and faced the stunned generals at the table. "Gentlemen," Sterling announced to the silent room, "for the last 2 hours, you've been trying to pick a lock designed by the man who invented the metal. This is Arthur Vance. From 1978 to 1995, he was the lead architect and sole overseer of the original Chimera protocol. He didn't just write the code. He imagined the ghost. He is the ghost." The reveal landed with the quiet finality of a coffin lid closing. The NSA director's mouth was slightly agape. General Markham sank slowly back into his chair, staring at Arthur as if seeing him for the first time. He wasn't a farmer. He was a phantom from the Cold War, the creator of their prison, sitting quietly in their midst the entire time. Reese felt a profound sense of vindication. His instincts had been right. The quiet man was the most dangerous one in the room. Arthur seemed unaffected by the revelation of his identity. He had lived with it for decades. Its unveiling was merely a matter of procedure to him. He watched Sterling with patient eyes, waiting for the pleasantries to conclude so they could get to the point. "You built it to be unbreakable, Arthur," Sterling said, turning back to him. "But you always insisted on a failsafe, a manual override. The committee at the time said it was a vulnerability." "The committee was made up of fools who thought a machine could be perfect," Arthur replied. "The only perfect thing is failure. You have to plan for it." He leaned forward, a slow, deliberate movement, and reached into the pocket of his worn denim trousers. The room held its collective breath. They expected a key card, a thumb drive, some piece of forgotten high technology. Instead, Arthur Vance pulled out a single, old-fashioned brass key. It was a simple skeleton key, the kind one might find in an antique shop. It was attached to a plain leather fob, worn smooth with time. He held it in his calloused palm for a moment, then placed it gently on the small, empty table beside his chair. The metallic clink was the loudest sound Reese had ever heard. There's a maintenance substation in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Arthur said, his voice a low monotone, reciting something from deep memory. Grid coordinate 4-8-1-5-1-6. It was decommissioned in '98, wiped from the Federal Registrar. It powers a single, isolated server rack. The heart. He looked at the key. That substation has a steel door with a standard tumbler lock. That key opens it. Inside, there is a terminal. It's not connected to any network. It has a cold boot system. You turn the key in the console. The system will ask for a prime number. Any prime number. That's the handshake. Once you enter it, the entire Chimera network will begin a cascading data purge. Total erasure. It will take 17 minutes. He pushed the key an inch forward with his forefinger. After that, Chimera will be gone. Forever. The solution was so brutally simple, so analog in a world of digital complexity, that it was almost incomprehensible. They had been fighting a ghost with algorithms and protocols, when all they had needed was a man with a memory and a piece of brass. Thorne stared at the key, his face a ruin of collapsed arrogance. A key? A physical key? That's the failsafe? That's primitive. Arthur's eyes finally showed a flicker of emotion. It wasn't anger. It was a distant, cold pity. The most reliable things are, son. General Markham stared at the key, then at Arthur. The humility in the general's face was profound. He had commanded fleets of bombers, overseen wars, held the fate of nations in his hands. And in that moment, he was completely humbled by an old man in a flannel shirt. "Reese," Markham said, his voice hoarse. He didn't look at Evan. His eyes were still locked on Arthur. "You have your entry vector." Reese nodded, his mind already spinning, planning the insertion, the logistics. But he didn't move just yet. He was watching the end of the story. Director Sterling looked at Arthur. "Will you come with them, Arthur? To the substation?" Arthur shook his head slowly. "No. My part is done." He stood up, his joints creaking softly. The movement was slow, measured, the walk of an old man who had earned his aches. He picked up his thermos from the floor. He didn't look at the generals or the key on the table. He had given them the solution. The implementation was their problem now. He had done his duty, twice. Once when he built it, and once more, today, when he gave them the means to unbuild it. He started walking toward the door, his dusty boots leaving faint, ghostly prints on the dark, polished carpet. He moved with the same quiet deliberation with which he had sat, a man leaving a job he had never wanted to return to. As he passed Lieutenant Commander Reese, he paused for a fraction of a second. He didn't turn his head, but his voice was clear. "Keep your head on a swivel, son. The ground out there is uneven." It was a simple piece of advice, a farmer's warning. But coming from him, it was also a blessing. A benediction from one quiet professional to another. Reese could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. "Yes, sir." The sir came out instinctively, an acknowledgement of a rank that had never been worn on a uniform but was etched into the man's very being. Arthur Vance walked to the reinforced door. It hissed open for him. He stepped through it without a backward glance, and it hissed shut behind him, leaving a room full of the most powerful people in the country staring at the empty space where he had been. For a long moment, nobody moved. They just stared at the door, then at the simple brass key sitting on the table, a relic from another time that held the solution to their futuristic nightmare. Director Sterling walked over and picked it up, his expression one of profound melancholy. He held it in his hand as if it were a sacred object. "General," Sterling said, his voice weary, "let's go save the world." The room erupted into a controlled chaos of action. The generals began barking orders into phones. Aide scrambled. The NSA director was already coordinating satellite overviews of the grid coordinates. Mr. Thorne, the contractor, was quietly and firmly escorted from the room by 2 security officers, his career over. Amidst it all, Reese stood still, his mind not on the mission ahead, but on the man who had just left. He walked to the door and looked down the long, sterile, white corridor. It was empty. The old man was gone, disappeared back into the world as easily as he had been pulled from it. The only evidence he had ever been there were the faint, dusty outlines of his boot prints on the otherwise immaculate floor, leading from the corner of the room to the door, and then out into the world. A ghost trail. Reese knew he would lead his team to the substation. They would turn the key. They would shut down the machine. It would be a successful mission, one for the history books that would never be written. But the real victory, he understood, hadn't been a matter of tactics or technology. It had been a matter of humility. The victory was in the moment when a two-star general finally stopped listening to the experts and chose to listen to the quiet wisdom of an old farmer. He turned back to the room, the sounds of mobilization washing over him. He felt a sense of clarity he hadn't had when he walked in. He had spent his life becoming a weapon, a finely honed tool for his country. But Arthur Vance had shown him something more. The old man had built a weapon, yes, but he had also built the means of its destruction. He had understood the awesome responsibility of creation, the necessity of control, and the wisdom of knowing when to let it go. He hadn't just been an architect of code. He had been an architect of conscience. As Reese went to join the briefing for the insertion, he took one last look at the empty chair in the corner. It was just a chair again, but for him, it would forever be a throne. The throne of the quietest, most powerful man he would ever meet. The farmer who had built a ghost and, with a single key and a few quiet words, had shown them all how to lay it to rest. The dust from his boots would be cleaned up by the morning, but for Reese, the impression he left would never fade.